So thank you, and good evening. Buenas tardes. First of all, let me tell you how honored I am to have been invited to speak here at the Casa Encendida in Madrid by the Association of Guatemalan Women. As I have already said several times since my arrival in Madrid, my two previous visits to Spain were to Barcelona this time last year, precisely at the height of the Catalan independence movement, and previously to Bilbao in the Basque Country, when Arnaldo Otegi was still in prison. In fact, I attempted to visit him in prison, but was denied a visitation and only met him in person after his release when he came to Barcelona a year ago. And we waited together on, I think it was October 10th, 2017, to hear the speech to Parliament that Carlos Puigdemont was delivering, in which, perhaps you remember, independence was initially declared, then temporarily suspended. But I'd like to say that here I am again in Spain, in Madrid, to speak to yet another crisis, the crisis of racism in Spain, and the necessity for any effective form of feminism today to explicitly develop analyses of and undertake struggles against racism. The theme this evening, as you already know, is feminism must be anti-racist if it wishes to respond to the demands of our time. And so I would like to thank Mercedes Hernandez, director of the Association of Guatemalan Women, and I'd like to thank Lucia Casani, who is director of La Casa Encendida, where we're gathered this evening. And a shout out also to the others who are gathered in different auditoriums, I think across the way. I am really happy to participate in this lecture series on women against impunity. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming out this evening, because you're supporting the work of these organizations by being present. I arrived the day before yesterday, very late at night. And I came directly from the United States, where the racism generated by virulent anti-immigrant attacks that emanate from the highest level of government, and where efforts to turn back the advances that we've made over the decades in our struggles against racism, gender discrimination, and for justice more broadly, dominate the political and juridical arenas. And generating pernicious expressions of racism against migrants from Honduras, Guatemala, Mexico, and elsewhere in Central America. The Trump administration, I suppose I should mention his name, although I dislike the feeling of his name rolling off of my tongue, I have to say. The Trump administration also raises the level of anti-Black and anti-Indigenous, anti-Asian, anti-Muslim racism as well. This process of regenerating and reproducing racism at the ideological level is closely linked to the reinforcement of gender discrimination, sexism, and misogyny. Many women who attempt to leave Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico, as Mercedes already pointed out, live in real fear. and I want to emphasize the fear of gender violence. Latin American feminists have developed important movements against femicide from Juarez to Guatemala City. In Rio de Janeiro, Marielle Franco, and I'm wondering how many of you are familiar with her name, Marielle Franco. She represented tangible political hope in Brazil, but was assassinated last March as she called upon progressive Brazilians to support Black feminist movements, speaking out against racism, misogyny, transphobia, and poverty produced by global capitalism. Women are on the rise in the world. Women's movements are at the forefront of most social justice struggles today, all over the world. And those that represent the future are movements that embrace feminisms that are also anti-racist and anti-capitalist. Unfortunately, as you've heard, not all feminisms embrace this view of justice, this more capacious view of justice. There are those who assume that feminism simply expresses the interests of a relatively small group of women, white, affluent, middle-class women in places like Europe, the US, and where else in the world? Perhaps Australia. I must confess that as a young activist, I often went to great pains to distance myself from feminism. Even when I was interpolated into feminism, I refused to answer the hail. I found myself at odds with what was mainstream feminism because although Black women were associated with some feminist movements, its public face was always white. And issues related to women were always handled too simplistically, as if they were primarily about affluent white women. This is why we call that feminism bourgeois feminism. Today, glass ceiling feminism, single issue feminism, feminism that assumes that only those women who are already at the top of the hierarchy and only need to penetrate the ceiling are the ones that really matter. You know, what about the women at the very bottom of the hierarchy? What about those women who worry about the floor collapsing underneath them? I thought I would begin by telling you an illustrative story. After I was acquitted in 1972, and I suppose you may know or may not know a bit about my trial. Well, anyway, maybe I should abbreviate and tell you that in 1970, I was charged with 3 capital crimes: murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy, when Richard Nixon was the president of the US and Ronald Reagan was the governor of California, and J. Edgar Hoover was the head of the FBI. And so there were those who assumed that I would be sent to the gas chamber. But as a result of a movement that existed all over the planet, including here in Spain, a movement demanding my freedom, I was released in the summer of 1972. And immediately after that trial concluded, we began to work on other cases of political prisoners. One of them was a young woman by the name of Joanne Little. And this is a story I want to share with you. Joanne Little was a young black woman, not very political. As a matter of fact, she had been charged with breaking and entering, burglary. This was in the state of North Carolina. She was arrested, placed in a facility that was primarily a men's facility, that was a men's facility, because they did not have jails for women in that small town. Eventually, she was charged with killing a prison guard. Apparently, the guard had entered her cell with an ice pick designed to force her to submit to rape. Well, Joanne grabbed the ice pick from the guard, and she stabbed him. He died. She was therefore charged with murder, and we developed a massive campaign for her freedom, pointing to the ways in which sexual assault was an integral part of the apparatus of imprisonment, just as it had been an integral aspect of slavery. A key piece of evidence was missing during the trial. I actually worked on the trial with the attorneys, as well as I became involved in organizing the mass movement for her freedom. A key piece of evidence went missing during her trial, and it was the guard's pants. And can you imagine why the pants might have been an important piece of evidence? He was stabbed in the legs by Joanne Little. As it turned out, when the pants finally appeared, there were no holes in the pants. So he had clearly taken off his pants when he went into the cell. It was a long, involved trial, and eventually she was found not guilty. It was a major victory at the time, believe me. The Emergent Feminist movement, this was 1974. The trial took place in 1974, at a time when what we call the women's liberation movement, or sometimes we refer to it as the second wave of the women's movement, the first wave having been in the 1920s. And so large numbers of white feminists embraced her case, because it was, after all, about a woman who had been sexually assaulted within an institution controlled by the state. And this was quite important. However, at precisely the same time, a young black man who was a theology student and had been hitchhiking was fraudulently charged with raping a white woman in the state of Florida. And I can tell you that his name was Delbert Tibbs. He eventually was released as a result of the Innocence Project. But he was someone who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And there's a whole history of the racist use of the rape charge that has to do with slavery, and especially the era of lynching in the aftermath of slavery. Well, we thought it might be important for the same people who were involved in the case of Joanne Little to take up the case of Delbert Tibbs, because after all, he had been fraudulently charged with rape, and that was an example of racism. In the same way, the guard attacking Joanne Little was an example of the structures of racism working within the punishment industry. But the feminist movements at that time did not want to have anything to do with defending a man who had been charged with rape. We worked really hard to try to make this point that feminism, if feminism is to enact any justice at all, it must be integral justice. It must be justice for all, and that it would have been extremely important for that movement to take up the case of Delbert Tibbs. Joanne Little herself issued an appeal to her supporters to also support Delbert Tibbs. Now, the reason I mentioned this particular case that took place in the United States in the early 70s was because I think that had the feminist movement taken up that case at that time and other similar cases, we might be much further along today in understanding interconnections and interrelationalities and intersectionalities. We might be further along in understanding the institutional and structural foundations of sexism and misogyny. And more about this later. But I think that today in the US, vast numbers of people understand that Black Lives Matter is a feminist slogan. Black Lives Matter is a feminist slogan. For we understand it as meaning all Black lives matter, women's lives, disabled people's lives, trans lives. And we know that we cannot defend Black women's lives without defending all women's lives. To speak up for Black disabled people is to speak up for all disabled people. To speak for Black trans women is to speak up for all trans people. Future understandings of feminism will recognize, I think, that the most productive path to the all, to the universal, is precisely through the particular, is precisely away from the tyranny of the universal, beginning with the universal and eradicating or eliding those who do not represent the universal. And let me give you another example from the US. Sometimes I ask audiences in the US, when did women get the vote? And people who are familiar with US history, they have an answer. And they say, without hesitation, 1920. And so I ask, did women really get the vote in 1920? Or are you talking about white women who got the vote in 1920? As a matter of fact, the majority of Black women did not acquire the right to vote until the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And so I suggest that perhaps when that question is asked, when did women get the vote, we say 1965. But in any event, feminisms, especially progressive, radical feminisms of the future, will have to understand how important it is to take up the deep structural meanings of racism and misogyny as we experience the violent afterlives of colonialism and slavery. Under the dominance of global capitalism, we are urged to believe that history doesn't matter, that only individuals competing on the market matter, that only profit matters, that only the next great acquisitive leap matters. Thus, the wealthiest 8 men in the world, and of course they're all men, own more than the poorest 50% of the world's population. I mean, that is pretty obscene, isn't it? And of course, 6 of those men are from the US. Should I name them? Well, I see many of you are holding iPhones and are probably on Facebook. And perhaps use Amazon, is that right? And so Jeff Bezos, of course, Amazon, he's the wealthiest person in the world. Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, Larry Ellison, who's from Oracle, Warren Buffett, and Michael Bloomberg. 4 or 6 of the 8 wealthiest men in the world are from the United States of America. One of them is actually from Spain, Amancio Ortega, right? You know him, Zara, right? And interestingly, the last one is from Mexico, Carlos Slim. This is obscene. And if you take a moment and reflect on the fact that together these 8 men own over $500 billion, that is $500 billion. I mean, can you even imagine that amount? If only it were more equitably spread throughout the world's population, we would be moving very clearly in the direction of eradicating poverty. If it is assumed that these 8 men acquired more than half of the world population's wealth simply because of their capitalist acumen, that is to ignore how capitalism itself developed and what Marx called the primitive accumulation of capital, the original accumulation of capital through colonialism and slavery. As a matter of fact, the populations we refer to in the US as people of color throughout the world carry the burden of the development of capitalism. Capitalism has always been racial capitalism from the very beginning. And perhaps we should say a few words about Spain. You think? Because since we're talking about primitive accumulation and colonialism, the Spanish Empire played a major role in the colonization of significant portions of the planet, from the Americas to the Philippines to Africa. The fact that Spanish remains the second most widely spoken language in the entire world, second, of course, only to Mandarin in China. This fact in and of itself attests to the history of Spanish imperialism. But of course, it's not for me as a person who lives in the US to come to Spain and teach you about your history. You know far more than I do. But I am aware that there are claims that racism isn't a serious problem in Spain. Maybe not by people in this space, but elsewhere. And those claims reminded me of a passage in a book that was recently written by a feminist anthropologist, activist in the Netherlands, whose name is Gloria Wekker. The title of her book, it's really a remarkable book, I would recommend it. The title of her book is White Innocence. And I was actually speaking about her book in the Netherlands recently, and I slipped and I said white guilt instead of white, but it's white innocence. The paradoxes of racism and colonialism. Although she writes about the particular situation in the Netherlands, her observations are, I think, more broadly applicable. And this is how she paraphrases the sentiment of many people in the Netherlands, many white people in the Netherlands. We are, and I'm quoting from her book, we are a small nation, innocent. We are inherently anti-racist. Moreover, we do not have bad intentions. And of course, everyone knows that Holland has been represented as tolerant and anti-racist and so forth. And right now, there's a very interesting movement, mass movement that's developing among young people against the particular expressions of racism in the Netherlands. She emphasizes that this sense of national self, this sense of innocence, is generated in a society that, and I'm quoting again, quote, that has managed to convince itself that nearly 400 years of colonialism have miraculously not left any traces of racism, either in culture, history, language, representations of the self and the other, or in institutions. Now, here in Spain, the repressed history of colonialism has returned with a very powerful force. Vast numbers of people from Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America, as Mercedes pointed out, are traveling to Europe, and specifically Spain, because of economic, military, and other forms of violence. And they're simply searching at great risk for better lives. As one migrant put it, this is someone I met in France, in Nantes, a migrant from Africa. He said, the Mediterranean is an African graveyard. The Mediterranean is an African graveyard, recapitulating the era when vast numbers of Africans being transported to a life of slavery in the Americas, my ancestors, died in the Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic was traditionally, historically, an African cemetery. Now, so too, on the other side of the Strait of Gibraltar is the Mediterranean. We should all ask ourselves, how can there be such insensitivity toward migrants? toward people from countries that were subject to multiple modes of exploitation in order to guarantee the wealth of Europe and the US. And of course, as I pointed out, I just recently traveled from the US, where Donald Trump, I'm mentioning his name a second time, is utilizing the caravan from Honduras through Guatemala, through Mexico, as a pretext to whip up the worst kind of racist sentiment. And we have elections coming up in a few days. So there's certainly a political motive, an ulterior political motive to those comments. Almost every time I visited Spain in the last, how many years? Since perhaps the mid-70s, I've mentioned the fact that I remember when I was a student in Germany, experiencing racism and looking for a place to stay. I was told over and over again when I was looking to rent a room, we don't find rooms for foreigners. Wir finden keine Zimmer für Ausländer. But who were the foreigners then? This is in the mid-1960s. I was studying in Germany from 65 to 67. Who were the foreigners? Who were the Ausländer? They were Spanish. They were Spanish workers. Germany had a guest worker, Gastarbeiter program, and it was Spanish workers who were the targets of a whole range of racist inflicted discriminations. And so I felt myself very much in solidarity with people from Spain at that time. But of course, here we are, how many years ago was that? Wow, I keep losing count. So that's almost 50 years, because it's been 50 years since 1960. No, it's more than 50 years, I'm sorry. I said that was in 1965. 19 sounds so old, doesn't it? But here we are, over 50 years later, and it is people from the Middle East, from Africa, from Latin America, who are held in migrant detention facilities in Spain, so often for much longer than the 72 hours that constitute the limit for people facing criminal charges. And I understand that that Spain now has about 46% of all arrivals, migrant arrivals. And seaborne migrants in this month, in October, amount to about 370 a day. Why can we not understand that these are the afterlives of colonialism and slavery? Immigrant detention and the facilities that are being developed with the assistance of private corporations. I understand that in Spain, privatization of migrant detention facilities is disallowed. But often services such as healthcare, et cetera, are outsourced to private corporations. And so there's still a connection to the market. I don't know whether you're aware of the fact that in the US, the most profitable sector of what we call the prison industrial complex is precisely immigrant detention. Because I don't have time to describe the vast industry that is imprisonment in the US, and the fact that the US has 25% of the planet's imprisoned population, with about 5% of the population at large. But even more interesting and more revealing, almost one-third of all women on the entire planet who are in prison are in a US jail or prison. So this tells you something about the centrality of these struggles against the prison industrial complex. In the US, the most profitable sector of the prison industrial complex is precisely immigrant detention. And even as there are calls to downsize the population of people in jails and in prisons, even the right has spoken out against mass incarceration now, which is interesting. Because they're not really attempting to end the conditions that are responsible for using prisons as a place in which to deposit people who have been rendered superfluous by the development of capitalism. They simply want to avoid placing so many government funds in these institutions called prisons, and so therefore other carceral forms of punishment, for using ankle bracelets and that kind of thing. But in any event, the point that I'm trying to make is that the private prison industry thrives on the repression of migrants. I want to devote the remainder of my remarks to what we have come to call abolition feminism. And I always realize when I'm in Europe, I have to be very careful because abolition feminism, to put abolition and feminism together, often refers to those feminists who are calling for the abolition of prostitution, right? Am I right? Okay. That is not what I'm talking about, because I definitely believe in the right of sex workers to organize. I am referring to prison abolition. I am referring to the abolition of the police. And this, of course, is in the tradition of anti-slavery abolition in the 19th century. Abolition feminism is feminism that is anti-racist and anti-capitalist. Feminism that recognizes the weight of history and that urges the abolition of the structures that are responsible for racism and misogyny. I'm speaking about a feminism that recognizes that the effort to produce better jails and prisons has most frequently led to the greater permanence of these carceral modes of punishment and to the spread of carcerality in everyday life. From Palestine, from occupied Palestine to the United States. As a matter of fact, we in the US have learned a great deal from Palestinian resistors intellectuals and activists alike. And I'm not sure about the extent to which the BDS movement here in Spain has popular support. Oh, I see a Palestinian flag in the back. Thank you very much. Because I think all over the world we need to thank the Palestinian people for not giving up. For not giving up. For pursuing justice decade after decade after decade, even as the United States, as Israel's most important ally, tries to turn the world against them. So thank you if you are involved in the movement for justice in Palestine here in Madrid. If you're not, I think the sister with the Palestinian flag can tell you where you might need to go in order to get involved. Feminism is not a unitary category. And therefore, in the US, we often use the term abolition feminism to distinguish our ideas and political strategies from those that are associated with what we call carceral feminism, a feminism that readily relies on violent systems of punishment for a sense of security in our worlds, including, strangely enough, a sense of security with respect to gender violence. Those who believe that the solution to gender violence is to simply send perpetrators to prison do not take into consideration the insight that violence cannot cure violence, but will rather result in the further reproduction and proliferation of violence. And that, in fact, this furthers the explicitly racist project of mass incarceration. Many years ago, again, I keep moving backwards in history. In the early 70s, which I now recognize was almost 50 years ago, when we first raised the call for prison abolition, there were those who argued that precisely at a time when we had just succeeded in having domestic violence and sexual assault recognized as crimes, we were calling for the abolition of a system that would have made male purveyors of violence against women accountable. Okay. All right. I have 5 more minutes. Now let me see.
¿Quieren preguntar?
Yeah. So we want, I'm sorry. Wow, I prepared too many notes for this session. Let me try to summarize a bit. The question, it seems to me, is how we can envision a world in which violence against women is no longer the most pandemic form of violence on the planet. Carceral feminism relies on criminalization. It helps in the buildup of prisons, not only in the US, but in Europe and throughout the global South. It also, therefore, bolsters the structural racism that is most dramatically seen in the prisons of the world, which hold a disproportionate number of Black and Latinx people, indigenous people, people from the global South. If we seek modes of accountability and transformation with respect to gender violence and with respect to acts of harm more broadly, we also cannot remain satisfied with the social, economic, and political structures that bolster racism, misogyny, and poverty. But women cannot simply aspire to take the places of men, but rather should aspire toward radical transformation. If we simply want to become what white, straight, cis men in power have been in the past, we are only replicating the structures that will continue to perpetuate the violence that we are challenging. If we don't challenge the structures, if we don't challenge the very meaning of the hierarchies of power, it could be said that women are simply fighting for the right to be as violent as men, and that would make no sense at all. And I should point out that I'm using these gender categories as if the binary was still intact. But I am, I guess I should explain that I'm using women in its most capacious meanings, including trans women as well. The point that I'm trying to make, maybe you all should stop applauding because I only have a few more minutes. We cannot simply call for the equality of women within institutions that do not themselves change. For example, to ask for equality within military contexts, allowing the military to remain the same is to suggest that women and LGBTQ communities want the right to wage war in the same way as conventionally gendered men have done in the past, and that would make no sense. We also say that as we support marriage equality for LGBTQ communities, we engage in radical critiques of the institution of marriage, which is grounded in capitalist notions of property inheritance, but also structurally harbors the very violence we oppose when we stand up against gender violence. Racist violence is not a consequence of bad racists. It is structural and ideological. Misogynist violence is not a consequence of bad men who are harassers and rapists. It is also structural and ideological. Prominent, I'm almost done, I think. Prominent and not so prominent white people perpetrate acts of racism. But so also do people of color. When a black cop kills black youth, this is evidence of the racism that is embedded in the very apparatus of policing. Prominent and not so prominent men also engage in sexual harassment and assault, and so also do some women. But if one focuses only on the individuals, racism and misogyny continued to be perpetuated by the apparatuses and the structures. And so now is the time to begin the very long and arduous process of learning how to recognize the role of structures, institutions, apparatuses in the long lives of racism, misogyny, transphobia, ableism, etc. Women have risen up throughout the world. Let us expand this awareness of the structural and institutional dimension of social and political repression. Let us learn how to deploy our imaginations. Indeed, the questions we are asking should not so much be how do we eradicate racism, sexism, economic exploitation from our existing societies, but rather what kind of society would no longer thrive on systematic violence directed at humans, at animals, at our environment. What would it be like? What would it take to create a society where we all feel like we truly belong? Thank you very much. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Ángela. Definitivamente estaríamos aquí contigo toda la noche escuchándote, pero sabemos que a pesar de todo eres humana y que tienes limitaciones de tiempo también, y eso lo comprendemos. Con el absoluto uso del privilegio que me concede estar aquí arriba, quiero pedirte, por favor, que respondas a una primera pregunta que quisiera hacerte antes de tener aquí arriba las preguntas que están enviando del público, las cuales agradecería mucho que me hagan llegar lo antes posible. Pero sí quiero pedirte, por favor, que brevemente regreses un poco sobre esta imbricación de opresiones que tú sueles estudiar, esa convergencia entre el racismo, el colonialismo y el patriarcado que sueles explorar y estudiar. Muchas gracias.
And do you want me to give a lecture on that?
Yes.
Well, actually, to answer it very simply, I would refer to a remark that was made by Dr. Martin Luther King many years ago, during which he pointed out that justice is indivisible. It is impossible to decide what groups deserve justice and which ones don't. If justice is indivisible, that means that whenever we do justice work, even as we're working toward a specific outcome, we work against the backdrop of an understanding of the intersectionality of all of our struggles. And that means not only issues I've been speaking about this evening, but it means, for example, recognizing that whatever we do, we have to undertake to save the environment, because environmental justice, one might argue, is the ground zero of social justice. And so it does not mean necessarily that we engage on all fronts, which of course we cannot do, but rather that we acknowledge the connections, the interrelationalities among all of the various forms of justice. And as we struggle, as we move forward, we discover other modes of justice about which we were not previously aware. And that is what is so exciting about being involved in the long run, in a protracted struggle for justice and equality in the world.
Muchas gracias, Ángela. Tenemos varias preguntas acá, pero quiero centrarme especialmente en dos que son muy importantes, pienso. Una de ellas es respecto a qué te parecen a ti las formas que hay de autoorganización y autorreferenciación por parte de las personas migrantes. Amplío un poco la pregunta. La pregunta que viene del público está basada especialmente en que las personas inmigrantes y refugiadas, las personas racializadas, podamos tener un propio discurso y nuestros propios referentes también.
Right, exactly. In response to that question, I would point out that too often people who become involved in campaigns to lend solidarity to migrants and to lend solidarity to prisoners, for example. Excuse me, I have allergies, so I have to cough. Okay, I think that did it. And oftentimes, because of the ideologies we internalize, we assume a charity position, a position of charity, that we're helping these poor people who don't really know how to help themselves. And it seems as if that stance indicates a replication of the very hierarchies we think we are challenging when we get involved in these kinds of activist struggles. And so autonomous organizing, self-organizing, is the answer, because I think oftentimes people who are experiencing a particular predicament know more about what they need than the people who come to tell them, what it is they need to do in order to be free. So I had the opportunity in Athens to visit a hotel, a massive hotel in the center of Athens that had been shut down after the crisis of 2008. And it was squatted, taken over by migrants and activists who, within a short period of time, created this remarkable community in which the migrants made decisions about how they were going to live, participated in every aspect of the governance of the place, cooked their food, did security, and it was really remarkable. And they did it for a very small amount of money, far, far less than is spent at these detention facilities that are so unhealthy and so saturated with violence.
Gracias, Ángela. Hay muchísimas preguntas, cada una de ellas interesantísima, pero creo que se repiten también. Creo que es muy importante una de ellas que significa, que dice, ahora que sabemos que el activismo académico está muy activo, ¿qué podemos hacer para llegar a todos nuestros hermanos y hermanas que no pertenecen al mundo académico? Y si me lo permites, Ángela, voy a unir una segunda pregunta que me parece también muy interesante, que es, usted que lleva más de 50 años en esta lucha, ¿qué consejo le daría a una persona que lleva solamente 4 y que se siente ya profundamente agotada?
Actually, I'll tell you a secret. It's been longer than 50 years, much longer than 50 years. Perhaps I should answer the second question first, and then I'll answer the question about academic activism, because I I think you can probably teach me a bit more about academic activism, since our activism in the US is not so much centered in institutions of higher learning, but rather is more community-centered. This isn't to say that academics don't play an important role. They do, but academics are not necessarily the leaders of the struggles. Also, although activists have often been trained academically, as a matter of fact, the three women who founded Black Lives Matter, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi, all of them have a university education, but they were all organizers. Opal Tometi was active in the immigrant rights movement, as a matter of fact. Alicia Garza was active in the Domestic Workers Alliance, and Patrice Cullors was active in campaigns against jail violence and prison violence, and with the Bus Riders Union. What's the secret to longevity? I guess that's the essence of that question. I suppose I myself have remained associated with radical movements for as long as I have, because this is the way I love living my life. Oftentimes, people assume that political activism is a chore, that it's a sacrifice. As a matter of fact, people are constantly thanking me for all of the sacrifices that I made. And my response is, I don't really think I sacrificed anything. I've loved doing this work. I've acquired a great deal of pleasure from doing this work. And even those moments that have been most difficult have provided insight and allowed me to live my life more fully. I often point out that when I was in jail, facing the death penalty 3 times, and you may know that Aretha Franklin announced that she would pay my bail. I don't know, this came out when she died recently, and I had those amazing memories of her giving the press conference saying that if bail is set for Angela Davis, I will give her $100,000, $200,000, or $250,000 if that's what it takes. But anyway, that's not what I was going to tell you about. I was going to point out that it was when I was in jail that I stopped eating meat, that I became a vegetarian, and then eventually I became a vegan. And I now realize that even though I had no consciousness at the time, that was a major gift. That I don't know what would have happened had I not gone to jail. And incidentally, I stopped eating meat because there were maggots in the meat. And it was pretty terrible. But I developed a consciousness of, an awareness of the need to eat consciously later. I also learned how to practice yoga when I was in jail, even though there were no yoga mats and there was no sense of yoga as an industry. I did it because I could not find any other way to relieve the stress. And that is something I still do today, almost 50 years later. And so even those difficult moments have provided me with gifts that I've been able to carry with me throughout my life. And so my suggestion is don't approach social justice activism as something that will not allow you to do what it is you really enjoy about life. Approach it as a way to discover yourself, and don't engage in those things that, I mean, if you're an artist, use your artwork, use your own talents, the things that you really love doing. Allow that to connect you to movements rather than respond to what you assume are the requirements of political activists. And then I think, then it won't be a problem.
Creo que vamos a poder hacer un par de preguntas más, Ángela, sí, cuando tú estés lista. Hay una pregunta que además te hicieron ayer repetidamente en la rueda de prensa y que tiene mucho que ver con debates actuales del feminismo en el Estado español. Una de ellas es, ¿cuál consideras que es el sujeto político actual del feminismo? Y quiero unirte esta pregunta también a otras dos que se parecen mucho, para que tú respondas en el orden que consideres correcto. Pregunta una persona, nos cuenta, son muchas las mujeres de África que no terminan de representarse en el feminismo. ¿Crees que sigue habiendo una brecha / distancia entre las mujeres negras y africanas y las mujeres afrodescendientes? ¿Cómo hacemos para valorar esta brecha si es que existe a día de hoy? Y esta pregunta sin duda viene por parte de alguna persona de la comunidad latina. ¿Qué piensas del día de la celebración en España del llamado Día de la Hispanidad, el 12 de octubre, cuando en realidad el 12 de octubre se da esto que llamamos en nuestra América la invasión española, sabiendo que para muchos latinos y afrodescendientes significa un enorme genocidio?
Well, to answer the last question first, in many states within the U.S., October 12th is not Columbus Day any longer. It's not the date that acknowledges discovery, whatever that means. Columbus didn't discover. He was discovered by the indigenous people who already inhabited the Americas. And so October 12th is often observed as Indigenous Peoples' Day. That might be the beginning here in Spain. Feminism, I was trying to make the point during my talk that feminism is not a unitary phenomenon. It's not one thing. There are different feminisms. And it is not necessary for us to assume that by identifying into feminism, we're identifying into a particular expression of feminism, that we're identifying into the mainstream representation of feminism. I think I mentioned that I had a hard time with this issue when I was young. Even, I wrote a book that was entitled Women, Race, and Class. And everybody started to call me a feminist. And so I said, I don't think I'm a feminist. I think I'm a revolutionary black woman. But then I wrote another book a little later. I can't remember where it came. I wrote it in the early 90s, and it's called Blues, Legacies, and Black Feminism. And I wanted to actually entitle it Blues, Legacies, and Black Feminisms. Because I think that when we speak about feminism, we should, if we're speaking about the general phenomenon, we should address it in the plural. because there are different feminisms, and I was suggesting some of the feminisms that need to be contested. Bourgeois feminism, and I think we can still, I don't know, maybe that term, it has a kind of archaic ring to it, but maybe it makes sense again during this era. I suppose I was drawn to identify into feminisms, women of color, radical feminisms, black feminisms, third world feminisms, whatever term we want to use, abolition feminism, which was a term that I used, precisely because the work of many scholars and activists to engage critically with hegemonic feminism has, at least in the US, had the impact of transforming the hegemony of a particular kind of feminism. The term intersectionality that you're probably aware of, am I right? I know, there's a lag, so I have to wait. Represents, while it's an academic term, and it's usually refers to the work of a legal scholar by the name of Kimberly Crenshaw. It actually is a shorthand method of referring to a whole history of contestations of hegemonic feminism that if I had time, I could speak about. But you know, African feminism, they're African feminisms. And so things don't remain the same. They're constantly changing. And sometimes I feel as if we treat feminism as if it were the feminism of the mid-1970s or the 80s, that actually there are enough feminisms of the global South and radical feminism, Marxist feminisms, Chicana feminisms, black feminisms, that we don't have to be satisfied with one expression of feminism, which unfortunately also incorporates the dominant ideologies. So today it's glass ceiling feminism. I mean, isn't that what Hillary Clinton talked about? Glass ceiling feminism? Yeah. And I would say that we should develop a practice of being critical even of the terms that we use to try to criticize. So whenever we say that we are referring to feminism, there needs to be a critical moment there, a critical dimension in which we make it very clear that this is not a feminism that is designed to keep in place the status quo and the existing institutions. It's might we say, a revolutionary feminism, a feminism that is dedicated to not only transforming what people think about gender and sexuality, but also about transforming the conditions in the world, bringing about a new, radically transformed society, socialist society, I might say. That's how I see it.
Una una última pregunta, aunque es más bien son dos peticiones en una. Creo que recordarás, Ángela, que uno de los hitos que el Estado español ha tenido recientemente fue la enorme convocatoria que tuvo la huelga del 8 de marzo de este año. Fue una huelga realmente muy grande. Nos han pedido de colectivos del 8 de marzo que hagas un llamado a la huelga. Es exactamente la misma petición que hemos tenido de colectivos de mujeres y hombres racializados. Y de hecho quiero hacerte que veas, que te gires hacia atrás y puedas ver la fotografía que tienes a tu espalda. La mayoría de estas mujeres... No he dicho que la foto sea del 8 de marzo. Estoy terminando. Te pedía que por favor vieses la foto porque vinculada a la petición que el colectivo 8 de marzo te hacía está también la de la huelga que se realizará el 11 de noviembre próximo por parte de colectivos de personas antirracistas y que nos pedían también que puedas hacer un llamamiento. Yo querría pedirte que hagas uno general muy corto de llamamiento, yo creo, en general a las resistencias y a las huelgas de las personas feministas y de las personas racializadas, si a ti te parece bien. Explican desde abajo, explican desde abajo que la del 11 de noviembre le llaman marcha, no le llaman huelga por las razones estructurales que hay detrás del concepto de huelga, por el no derecho de las personas racializadas a la huelga.
And so you want me to call for people to join? Okay. All out on March 8th for the strike. And so what are the themes? Are anti-race? What are the themes? And the 11th of November as well. El 11 de noviembre y el 8 de marzo. Absolutely. You know, I'm reminded of a comment that an activist, intellectual, scholar activist by the name of John Berger made in 1968 in the context of the mobilizations against the war in Vietnam. He wrote a short piece on the nature of mass demonstrations. And he made the point that demonstrations are rehearsals for revolution. It's important to participate in demonstrations because we acquire a sense of where we are going, even though we have not yet acquired the means to move ourselves in that direction. So it is important to engage in mass mobilization and sense the community that is created, not only the community that is marching and demonstrating on the 11th of November and the 8th of March, but the community, the world to come. And that is the closest we get to understanding the meaning of freedom.
Muchísimas gracias, Ángela, por responder ampliamente a la mayoría de preguntas. Creo que en estas que has respondido respondes a la mayoría de personas que tenían alguna cuestión que realizarte. Quiero agradecerte una vez más, nunca serían suficientes veces el hecho de que nos hayas acompañado. Nuevamente, muchísimas gracias a la Casa Encendida. Quiero agradecerte especialmente que hayas tocado algunos de los temas que yo creo son muy sensibles dentro del feminismo del Estado español y dentro de los movimientos del Estado español, dentro de los movimientos sociales actuales. Entre ellos te quiero agradecer especialmente el haberte referido a ese cementerio que es el Mediterráneo a día de hoy, temas que también hemos tratado en el ciclo de conferencias Mujeres contra la Impunidad. Quiero agradecerte también muy especialmente que puedas analizar cómo otros seres subalternizados, como los otros animales que nos acompañan en el mundo, han sufrido estas privaciones de libertad, estas torturas y demás que los seres humanos pues dejamos pasar cuando no se trata de nosotros y de nosotras mismas. Muchísimas gracias por ello. Por lo demás, quiero también agradecerte enormemente el hecho de que hayas hablado de un feminismo amplio que incluya a nuestras hermanas trans, a todas aquellas mujeres que han sido muy maltratadas por parte de algunos feminismos hegemónicos y que, sin embargo, quieren y desean unirse al feminismo, pero a quienes se les exigen en muchas ocasiones cosas que no nos exigimos entre las propias feministas que nos hacemos llamar cismujeres. En este sentido, quiero recordar el poema de Isabel Agatón que se llama Yo tuve un sueño, en el cual hace alusión al famoso discurso del doctor Martin Luther King, Yo tuve un sueño. Isabel Agatón dice, y esto lo quiero decir también por nosotras las mujeres latinas y no solo por mis hermanas mujeres trans, que ella sueña y ella ha tenido un sueño. Ese sueño es el día en el que las mujeres seamos juzgadas por la altura de nuestras ideas y no solamente por la altura de nuestros tacones. Quiero finalmente agradecerte el hecho de que nos recuerdes que Europa ya no es blanca, que España ya no es blanca, que estamos que las personas que estamos aquí nos encargaremos de que estos colores, esta diversidad de colores se represente en cada espacio, en cada lugar económico, social y político. Allí donde no nos dejen entrar, tumbaremos las puertas, lo avisamos. Gracias de nuevo, Ángela. Millones de gracias por acompañarnos, por servirnos de inspiración, por ser utopía para tantas personas de nosotras.